The florist was the third vendor to cancel in 6 weeks. Each time with a different explanation. Each time professionally communicated. Each time leaving just enough ambiguity that you couldn't point to anything specific as wrong. My fiancée, Sarah, noticed the pattern before I did. Said it quietly one evening. That this didn't feel like bad luck. That bad luck doesn't have a consistent shape. We sat with that for a while. Then we started looking more carefully. At the cancellations. At the venue availability issue that had appeared from nowhere. At the family members who had received strange information about Sarah. Information that was specific enough to have come from someone close. We started pulling threads, each one carefully, without telling anyone what we were doing, or why. The threads led somewhere I had not allowed myself to consider before we started pulling them. Every single one, to the same place, the same person, my sister, who had been smiling at family dinners the entire time. But to understand what that investigation found, you need to know what the years before the wedding had contained. Rachel is 2 years older than me. We grew up in the same house, share the same parents, the same extended family, the same particular texture of a childhood that belongs to two people who have been present for all of each other's significant moments. I know her completely. That is the honest statement. Not just the surface version, the full version. The version that includes the things you only know about someone after decades of proximity. Their specific patterns, the way they manage disappointment, the way they respond to other people's success, the particular shape of their competitiveness. And Rachel had always been competitive, not in the open way, not the kind that announces itself in direct challenge or open confrontation, the quieter kind. The kind that expresses itself through the specific mechanisms of someone who understands that direct competition is observable and that observable competition carries social costs. So it doesn't present as competition. It presents as concern, or as practical help that somehow complicates rather than assists, or as information shared with the right people at moments that create doubt rather than clarity. I've been watching that pattern my entire life. Had named it to myself. Had never named it publicly because naming it would have required producing evidence that was always just beneath the threshold of the undeniable. Each individual incident explainable. The accumulation visible only to someone paying the specific kind of attention that years of proximity produces. When I announced the engagement, Rachel's reaction was surface level exactly right. Warm, enthusiastic, the appropriate response of a sister who is happy for her brother. She said the right things, in the right tone, with the right timing. I watched it and felt the specific unease of someone who knows a performance when they see it. Not because the performance was bad, because it was too practiced, because the warmth arrived without the particular quality of surprise that genuine warmth carries when it is responding to unexpected good news. She had prepared the response, which meant she had known how she was going to respond before she was told, which meant she had already processed how she felt about it, and had decided how she was going to present that processing, none of which is damning on its own. People manage their responses, process feelings before expressing them, present better versions of their reactions. That is not unusual. What I was reading was more specific than that. The quality of a person who has decided that the presentation needs to be particularly careful, because the underlying feeling requires particular management. Sarah met Rachel for the first time about a month after the engagement. I watched that meeting with more attention than I allowed to show. Rachel was charming, asked the right questions, showed the right interest, created exactly the impression she intended to create. Sarah found her warm, said so afterward. I received that without saying what I was thinking, which was that warmth deployed with that precision is not the same as warmth. The wedding planning began. Sarah and I were methodical about it. Vendors chosen carefully. Contracts reviewed. Deposits paid. The particular work of two organized people building something they wanted to be right. We were happy during that process. Genuinely. The specific happiness of two people who have chosen each other and are building the occasion that marks that choice. It lasted about 3 months before things started going wrong. Small things first. One vendor citing a scheduling conflict I hadn't expected. A family member mentioning in passing something about Sarah that was slightly wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Wrong in the specific way of information that has been passed through someone who has shaped it slightly. I noted both, said nothing, and waited to see if the pattern continued. It did. The photographer canceled first, 7 weeks before the wedding. A professional communication. Regrettable circumstances. Unable to fulfill the booking. Deposit would be returned in full. Nothing in the message that indicated anything beyond an ordinary professional cancellation. These things happen. Photographers have emergencies. Personal circumstances arise. I thanked them, filed a note of the cancellation, and began looking for a replacement. The caterer followed 2 weeks later. Same tone, same regret, same professional language of an obligation being withdrawn without detailed explanation. Different vendor. Same outcome. Sarah was the one who noticed the pattern after the caterer. She said it quietly one evening, not dramatically, in the specific tone of someone who has been thinking about something and has decided it is worth saying. She said 2 vendors canceling in close succession was unusual. That vendors in the wedding industry don't cancel casually. That the reputational cost of cancellation is significant. That something had to have happened in each case that made cancellation preferable to delivering the service. I agreed, said I'd been thinking the same thing. We looked at the 2 cancellations alongside each other, tried to find a common factor, a shared element that might explain why 2 separate businesses had withdrawn from the same wedding within a few weeks of each other. Nothing obvious emerged from that first examination. We extended the examination. The venue issue had appeared around the same time as the caterer. Not a cancellation, a communication from the venue manager flagging a potential conflict in their booking schedule, suggesting a contingency conversation might be prudent. Nothing confirmed, just a flag that had required 2 weeks of additional communication to resolve. 3 things. Different businesses, different relationships, different specific issues, but occupying the same window, around the same period in the wedding planning. Sarah said she wanted to make some calls, not to the vendors directly, to people she knew in the industry, contacts she had from previous work, people who might have heard something, or who might be willing to describe what had happened if approached carefully. She made those calls over several days, quietly, without telling me the details until she had something specific to report. What she brought back was not a complete picture, but it was a shape. The photographer had received a message, not from us, from someone who had raised concerns about the client, described in terms vague enough to be difficult to specifically challenge, but specific enough to create doubt. The caterer had had a similar experience. A contact who had asked questions, expressed concern, presented themselves as someone who knew the situation and felt obligated to flag something. The venue had received a call about a scheduling conflict that turned out not to exist, but that had required time to verify as non-existent. The calls and messages had different forms, different specific content, but a common architecture. Someone presenting themselves as connected to the wedding, raising concerns or complications that required the recipient to take action. Action that created exactly the disruptions we had been managing. Sarah said it clearly. These didn't come from nowhere. They came from someone who knew the vendors, who knew the booking details, who had enough specific information to make the contacts credible, and who had been working through the vendor list. Systematically, I sat with that. Then I thought about who had that information. The vendor list had been shared within the family, at a dinner early in the planning process, where Sarah and I had outlined the general shape of the wedding, the venue, the approximate timing, the suppliers we had engaged, the particular sharing that happens when you're excited about something and want the people around you to feel included in it. Rachel had been at that dinner, had asked specific questions about each vendor, with the particular engaged interest of someone who wanted to understand the full picture. I had found that interest warm at the time. I found it specific now. I didn't say Rachel's name to Sarah that evening, but I started building the documentation the following morning. The documentation process took 3 weeks, not because the evidence was difficult to find, because finding it required care, required approaching each element in a way that produced something specific rather than something circumstantial, something that pointed clearly enough that it could not be explained away. Sarah and I worked through it together, dividing the elements between us, each taking the threads we were best placed to follow. She had the industry contacts, the people who could speak to what had happened with each vendor, who could describe in more detail the nature of the communications they had received. I had the family context, the specific knowledge of Rachel's patterns, the history that gave the current situation its meaning, the ability to recognize her particular way of operating in the shape of what had been happening. We built it methodically, starting with the photographer. Sarah went back to her contact, asked more specific questions. The message the photographer had received had been sent from an email address that presented itself as a mutual contact, someone who knew both the photographer and the wedding party, who was reaching out of concern. The concerns raised were specific to Sarah, her reliability, her character, the suggestion that the narrator might not be fully aware of certain things, delivered in the particular language of someone who wanted to appear reluctant to say what they were saying, who had framed the message as a difficult decision to send, a friend who felt they had no choice but to say something. Sarah asked her contact to describe the email address. The contact remembered the general format, not the full address, but enough, a format that suggested a name rather than a business, a name that began with a specific letter. I noted that, continued building. The caterer situation was similar. A contact, a concern raised, specific enough to create doubt, vague enough to be difficult to disprove without investigation. The contact in this case had apparently known details about the wedding that a casual acquaintance would not have known. The venue, the date, the guest list size, details that told the caterer the contact was genuinely connected to the event, and therefore worth taking seriously. I thought about who had those details, who had been given them, at what point in the planning. The answer was consistent each time I asked it: the family dinner, where everything had been shared openly, where Rachel had asked her specific interested questions, and where I had given her specific interested answers. I pulled the guest list communications, the emails we had sent to family members with the wedding details, dates, venue, accommodation suggestions, the information package that goes to people who need to plan around the event. Rachel had received it. Obviously, she was family. She had been included in the full communication, which meant she had everything she needed to contact every vendor on the list, to present herself as a concerned connection, to raise the specific doubts that had produced the specific outcomes we had been managing. The family member situation was the most personal element. 3 family members had received information about Sarah, each slightly different, each carrying the particular quality of something that had been shaped before being delivered. Not lies exactly, reframings, details accurate in themselves, but placed in a context that gave them a meaning they didn't carry in their original form. I spoke to each family member, carefully, without telling them what I was doing or why, just asking questions that allowed me to understand what they had been told and how. Each conversation produced a consistent picture. The information had arrived through a personal communication, someone who had presented themselves as concerned, who had shared what they were sharing reluctantly, who had framed the sharing as being for the narrator's benefit. The specific architecture of someone who wanted the impact without the visibility, who wanted the doubt planted without being identified as the planter. By the end of the 3 weeks, I had a folder, not circumstantial, specific, email format consistent with a name I knew, timing of each incident mapped against known periods when Rachel had access to the relevant information. The specific details that had been shared with each vendor consistent with information Rachel had received. The architecture of each communication consistent with her particular way of operating, which I had been watching for my entire life, and which I now had documented. I called Rachel, asked if she could come over, said I wanted to talk before the wedding. She said, of course, arrived with the ease of someone who didn't know what was coming. I sat across from her at my kitchen table, the folder between us, and began. I opened the folder, placed the first document on the table between us, the photographer's account, the nature of the communication they had received, the email format that had been described, the specific concerns that had been raised. Rachel looked at it. Her expression did not change immediately. The particular stillness of someone deciding how to respond before responding. I had expected that, had prepared for it, not with anger, with the specific patience of someone who has more to show and is not in a hurry. I placed the second document alongside the first, the caterer's account, the same architecture, the same framing, the details that had been shared to establish credibility, details she had received at the family dinner. She looked at the second document. The stillness remained, but something underneath it had changed. The quality of someone calculating rather than simply processing, assessing what was in front of them, and what might still be coming. I placed the third, the venue, the fourth, the family member accounts, each one placed without comment, without explanation, without the emotional loading that would have given her something to respond to other than the evidence itself. Just documents, placed one by one, on the table between us. By the time the fifth was down, the calculation had reached its conclusion. I could see it in how she was sitting. The specific adjustment of someone who has understood that the position they were in when they arrived is not the position they are in now. That the conversation they expected to have is not the conversation that is happening. I finally spoke. I said I'd spent 3 weeks building what was in front of her, that I had been careful to gather specific things rather than circumstantial ones, that everything in the folder pointed in one direction, and that I thought she understood which direction that was. She said nothing for a long moment. I let the silence exist, did not fill it, did not offer her the comfort of a question she could answer rather than a statement she had to sit with. Then she said she could explain. I said I had given her the opportunity to look at everything before saying that I wanted to know what the explanation was, not because it would change what I knew, because I wanted to hear her say something true. For once, in the context of this situation, what she said was not a full explanation. It was the partial account of someone who is giving you enough to seem honest while withholding the parts that would be most damaging. She said she had been worried, that things had moved quickly, that she hadn't felt she knew Sarah well enough to be comfortable, that she had done some things she wasn't proud of, that she hadn't intended for it to get as far as it had. The language of someone who has understood that denial is no longer available, but who is managing how much of the truth surfaces. I listened to all of it, without interrupting. When she finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said what I had decided to say before she arrived. I told her I was not going to tell the family what was in that folder. Not at the wedding. Not after. That was not the conversation I was interested in having with them. What I was interested in was the wedding happening the way it was planned, without any further disruption, and in her being present at it in a way that reflected the appropriate behavior of a family member at her brother's wedding. That was the choice I was offering her. She could come, and she could behave with the dignity the occasion required. Or she did not come at all, and the folder existed. In future conversations about family occasions and her relationship to them would be informed by what was in it. She looked at me, the specific look of someone hearing terms they had not expected and who is assessing whether they are negotiable. I held her gaze, without anything visible in my expression beyond the calm of someone who has made a clear decision and is not going to be moved from it. She said she would be there, said it simply, without elaboration, without the particular performance of remorse that would have felt like another management, just the direct acceptance of the terms. I thanked her, closed the folder, said I would see her at the wedding. She left. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after she had gone. Not processing, just sitting. The conversation had gone exactly as I had prepared for it to go. Nothing in it had surprised me. Nothing in her response had produced anything I hadn't expected, which was itself a kind of confirmation of everything I had known about her for my entire life, and of the specific way she had operated in the months before that conversation. I put the folder in a drawer and called Sarah, told her it was done, that the wedding was going to be fine. She asked how the conversation had gone. I told her it had gone the way it needed to go. She said that was enough, and it was. The 5 weeks between the conversation and the wedding were the cleanest 5 weeks of the entire planning process. No cancellations, no complications, no strange information reaching family members, no flags from the venue, nothing that required investigation or management or the particular vigilance we had been maintaining for months. Just the ordinary work of finalizing a wedding. The replacement vendors had been found during the investigation period. A photographer whose work we liked more than the original. A caterer whose menu suited the occasion better than the one we had lost. The venue had been resolved. The guest communications had gone out correctly. The family members who had received strange information had received nothing further. The machinery of the wedding moved through its final stages without disruption. I noticed that absence of disruption specifically, not as relief, as information. The clean 5 weeks told me what the preceding months had told me. But the disruptions had not been bad luck, had not been the ordinary friction of complex event planning, had been produced, and had stopped being produced at the precise moment the conversation in my kitchen had concluded, which was its own kind of confirmation of everything the folder had established. Sarah and I did not talk about Rachel much during those 5 weeks, not because the subject was avoided, because the subject had been addressed. The conversation had happened. The terms had been accepted. The wedding was proceeding. What remained was the wedding itself, and we directed our attention there. Rachel behaved in the 5 weeks the way someone behaves when they understand clearly that their behavior is being watched. Not warmly, correctly. She attended the events she was expected to attend, said the things that were appropriate to say, maintained the surface with the competence she always brought to maintaining surfaces. But the particular competitive energy that had always been underneath the surface, the specific quality I had spent decades watching, was absent during those weeks, or at least managed below the threshold of visibility, which was sufficient. I was not looking for transformation. I was looking for the correct behavior in a specific context. She provided it. The morning of the wedding arrived with the particular quality of mornings that contain something significant, not the anxious quality that these mornings sometimes have, a settled quality, the specific feeling of a person who has done the preparation and is ready for the occasion. Sarah was the calmest I had seen her in months. Not performing calm, actually calm. The specific serenity of someone who has navigated something difficult and has arrived at the other side of it, ready to do the thing they came to do. I saw Rachel briefly before the ceremony. She was composed, presented herself appropriately. We exchanged the brief words of 2 people in a busy morning who were each managing their own part of a large occasion. Nothing in the exchange that required more than the exchange offered. Clean, sufficient. The ceremony was exactly what we had wanted it to be. The kind of occasion that reflects the people getting married rather than the convention of the form, that carries the particular warmth of genuine relationships gathered in one place, that produces the specific feeling of something important being witnessed by the right people. Rachel sat in her place, behaved with the dignity I had specified, contributed to the day in the way that a family member contributes simply by being present and appropriate. Nothing more, nothing less. The reception was the best part, not because of anything specific that happened, because of the accumulated quality of it. The friends who had traveled to be there, the family members whose warmth was genuine, the specific texture of a celebration that contains real happiness rather than performed happiness. Sarah danced with her mother for a long time during the evening. I watched them from across the room. The particular image of two people who love each other in a moment that belongs entirely to them. That is the image I return to when I think about that day. Not Rachel, not the folder, not the 5 weeks of investigation or the conversation at the kitchen table. Just Sarah and her mother, and the specific quality of the happiness in the room, which was exactly what we had built toward, and which had arrived intact, despite everything that had been attempted to prevent it. The wedding photographs arrived 6 weeks later. We went through them together on a Sunday afternoon. The particular pleasure of revisiting something good, of seeing familiar moments through the lens of someone who had been paying attention in the way that professional photographers pay attention. Rachel appeared in several of them, in the family group shots, in the background of moments that had been captured from different angles. She looked the way she was supposed to look, present, appropriate, a family member at a family occasion. Nothing in any of the photographs that suggested anything other than a sister at her brother's wedding. I looked at those photographs with a specific clarity, not the clarity of someone examining evidence, the clarity of someone who had already done the examining and was now simply looking at pictures of a day that had gone well. The folder was still in the drawer, not forgotten, filed, the way you file something that is not currently in use, but that you understand has a purpose. Not as a weapon, as a record, the record of what had happened and how it had been managed, in case it was ever needed. I had meant what I said to Rachel about not telling the family, not as a strategic decision, as a genuine choice, because what telling them would have produced was not something I wanted to produce, not the truth being known, which I would not have objected to on its own terms, but the specific disruption that the truth being known would have created in the family. The arguments, the sides, the particular fracturing that happens when something ugly is brought into the open in a family context. My parents would have been devastated, not just by what Rachel had done, by the knowledge that their children had arrived at this, that the family they had built contained something that had produced a 3-month campaign against one of their children's weddings. I had no interest in giving them that. The wedding had happened. The family had gathered. The occasion had been what we wanted it to be. That was what mattered. The truth could live in the drawer, serving its purpose without being broadcast. My relationship with Rachel after the wedding adjusted quietly, not dramatically. No confrontation, no declaration, no announcement to anyone about a change dynamic. Just the natural recalibration of two people who have had a conversation that permanently changes the basis of their relationship. We remained in contact. Family occasions continued. We were present at the same events, exchanged the appropriate words in the appropriate contexts. But the particular openness that I had always extended to her, the specific trust that had allowed me to share things with her, the assumption that information given to her was held safely, all of that closed, quietly, without announcement, just a door that had been open and was now not open. She understood that it had closed. I believe she understood why. We did not discuss it, did not need to. The understanding lived in the space between us without requiring articulation. Sarah and I talked about Rachel once in the months after the wedding. A long, honest conversation about what the whole experience had revealed, about what it meant for the relationship going forward, about how to navigate family occasions in a way that was sustainable. That conversation produced something useful, not a plan exactly, a shared understanding of what we were navigating, of what we were willing to invest in it, of where the limits were, and of the specific difference between maintaining a family relationship for the sake of the people it was embedded in, and trusting the person at the center of it. Those were two different things. We could do the first without the second, and we would, because my parents deserved a family that functioned, even if the functioning required a specific kind of management that it hadn't previously required. I thought about the investigations sometimes, not with ongoing anger, with the specific admiration you feel for something that was done well. Because Sarah had done it well. The industry contacts, the careful questions, the patient building of a picture from fragments. She had brought the same quality of attention to the investigation that she brought to everything. The specific thoroughness of someone who does not accept the surface version of a situation when the surface version doesn't add up. That quality was one of the things I had loved about her before the wedding. It became one of the things I valued most after it. She had seen the pattern before I had said it quietly rather than dramatically, had worked through it methodically rather than reactively, had produced a folder that had made the conversation possible, and had then stepped back from the wedding morning with the specific grace of someone who had done what needed to be done and was now ready to simply be the person getting married. I found that extraordinary. Still do. The wedding was 2 years ago now. The photographs are on the wall. Sarah and her mother in the moment I returned to. The family gathered in the frames that show what it looked like from the outside. The folder is still in the drawer, untouched since I filed it. Rachel is still my sister, still at the family occasions, still performing the surface with the competence she has always brought to it. But the openness is gone, and the specific trust that the openness required is gone alongside it. What remains is the relationship that is possible between two people who know what they know, who have chosen to exist in the same family without requiring the other to account for what they did, but who do not pretend that what was done was not done. That is the relationship. Functional, managed, permanently different from what it was, and entirely sustainable on those terms. Not every betrayal needs to be announced. Some things are best filed away, the relationship adjusted permanently, and the occasion protected from the person who tried to ruin it. If this story resonated with you, the quiet investigation, the private confrontation, the wedding that happened perfectly anyway, leave in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.